This question applies to so many people that it's almost a rhetorical question. But do you ever feel as though your worth as a human is dependent on what you do? For instance, how you perform at work, how you look, the transactional nature you might approach relationships with, such as they'll love me as long as I'm showing up as my best and giving a ton. We're going to talk in this episode predominantly about the idea of contingent self-worth or conditional self-esteem. These mean basically the same thing. It's where our love or how we feel about ourselves is conditional based on behaving a certain way, looking a certain way, or how others view us. Welcome to Immersion. I'm your host, Pamela, and here we explore psychology and philosophy topics to find meaning in the modern world. This is part 4 in a series we're doing where we are working on developing our relationship to ourselves. Last episode, we did a deep dive on self-worth, but this week we're going to keep going deeper on that topic because there's more there. Of course, it's a heavy topic. You don't need to have listened to it, although probably better if you have. I'll link it down below in case you want to go there first or second, but let's get into it. The idea of contingent or conditional self-worth is where a person has completely outsourced how they feel about themselves to the external based on achievements, based on what other people think about them. So it is a roller coaster of ups and downs because it is impossible to be operating perfectly 100% of the time. So it is absolutely a recipe for failure. If you're watching this, you probably know that. And you might be turning to an episode like this if you're at a phase in your life where you realize this isn't working. Because when everything's going great, we might not even question this because we feel great. But the problem is not only that we can't always look perfect in the eyes of others, we can't always be achieving perfectly,
but it's also that often our values don't line up with other people's. There's a part from the 6 pillars of self-esteem, which we talked about in the second episode of this series. In the book, Brandon discusses the idea that some people might say, well, what if you live in a society that really values something that you happen to value? Isn't it okay if you get your self-esteem then from the outside? But he argues that at some point, your values will differ. Sure, maybe you're in a society that values money and you happen to be making a lot. Or maybe you're in a society that values family orientation and you're very family oriented. But at some point, you will be in places, cultures, settings that have different values from you. And it's really important that you know what matters to you so that you can stay true to that and generate the self-esteem from the inside.
And before we debunk and go into all of the ways that we can go more from the inside out instead of the outside in, I do just want to play devil's advocate for a second and bring up the fact that, yes, tons of people like to bring up the evolutionary psychological approach that we evolved in tribes. It is normal to care what other people think of us. And yes, I think that there's truth to that. Like we talked about in the last episode, it's also just healthy to gut check things with other people. But I also think there's 3 things we can do with this. 1, we can evolve a bit beyond this. We can realize that, yes, at a certain time, being excluded or being looked down upon could equal death and being kicked out of the tribe. Sure. Okay, we can just hold that in our mind. Knowing that and awareness can be a step in moving beyond it. And we can also notice and give compassion to how we're feeling when it feels like the earth is crumbling down, when we're not accepted in a certain group. We can realize, yep, this is natural. This is normal. I can be with myself through this and breathe through this. Also, though, we can realize how much easier it is in this day and age to find our tribe. Like you've also probably heard that phrase. For instance, finding people that have the same nerdy interests that you do, or finding people that accept and support your way that you want to live life. And very importantly, step 3 is we can learn to separate these things, how we are performing from our inherent worth as a human being. That is the true work that we're going to get into here. And this process kind of reminds me of when you fall in love with someone. At first, when you start liking someone, meeting someone, developing a crush, often it is for more superficial reasons, such as how they look when they smile and something that you find impressive about them, a trait that you want to develop, or these things that are just a bit more superficial. But then as you come to get to know and love them, there are a couple other things that really make you fall for them, which is one, even their flaws are just part of what make them human and lovable too. Not needing to be in a relationship with a perfect person, nor wanting to be, because that doesn't exist. It's an illusion. They're either wearing a mask or you're not seeing them clearly. So there is that depth of being with a full human, but then also loving them for who they are under that, their authenticity and spontaneity, the things that are just purely them, such as, for one person, it might be true generosity, not the type that they think they need to earn your love. So loving someone at their core. And I think we can learn to do that with ourselves too. So at first we might love ourselves or think we love ourselves for, oh, I am performing well at work, I dress well, I show up on time, I check all these boxes, versus, again, loving a complete version of ourselves and also loving who we are under that, which, like we talked about in the last episode, might take some time to get to know. And we will have another episode later in the series on identity and knowing yourself and getting to know yourself. So we can talk more about that there. So where does this idea come from, this idea of conditional or contingent self-worth? Mainly two places. One is the home, how many people are brought up. Often they are taught that you will be loved if you behave a certain way. Now, this is generally not said directly. It is not something where someone brings home good grades and the parent says, "Good job, you got A's, I love you. If you did not bring home A's, I would not love you." That's not how it works. This is reinforced through very subtle things about how their tone of voice might be when you behave a certain way, or the way they might completely emotionally shut you out when you have a certain emotion. And we start to learn that I need to be a certain way to earn and deserve love. Another aspect that reinforces this just as much is our society as a whole. Currently, our society is in a place that asks, "What have you done for me lately?" For instance, at work, how have you increased profitability for shareholders? Not, did you help that one teammate that was struggling? It does not care about that as much, unfortunately, and that is reinforced through the market. But also, even how you look. I really don't love this, but how we look really does affect how other people treat us. Now, it's not 100% that, oh my goodness, people are only nice to you if you look a certain way, because I also think that we slightly change our posture, our smile, how we show up energetically when we feel good about how we're showing up and presenting ourselves. But I will say, I got a new blow dryer and it is shocking how many more just little smiles I get from people on the days that I use that blow dryer versus the weeks that I don't. And it's not just men, it's even older women that will just be like a little more friendly to me or something. So it is unfortunate. And I'm sure you might have noticed this too. I actually have an episode that I'll link below called "Do Attractive People Have Easier Lives?" that talks about how different people are treated based on how they look. And it kind of pulls apart this question from many angles. It's not all what you'd think it would be, so I'll link that down below. But what I'm talking about here is that, at least at this point in society, because they don't know you and where we are as a civilization, often we will objectify others not on purpose. And because we're objectified, we treat ourselves like objects often and then think, okay, how can I be good enough so that this mirror across from me can mirror back to me something that shows that I am good enough? I want to be good enough to that other person. How can I then be what they deem good enough so that then they will reflect that back to me and I will feel okay? Whew. No wonder we feel so bad. That is not a great way to be living. It's taxing, it's inauthentic. Frankly, it's a little depressing. And also it's transactional. And then as a result of that, we're essentially turning ourselves into a commodity, not only how others see us, but how we're seeing ourselves. Which brings me to the idea, let's take apart the word worth and what that means. Worth typically refers to the value of something measured in money or its inherent importance, merit, and usefulness, per Merriam-Webster. Often we use worth to indicate financial value. For instance, is this desk worth $200? Often when we see something in a store, even before we looked at the price tag, we kind of know in our head, oh, it's worth X, Y, or Z. I would not pay more than X amount for that. So as a result of this, some people argue then that self-worth is not even the right word. It sort of sets ourselves up to view this in a very transactional, commodified sense. So what other words might we use instead? Our personhood, our dignity, our being, our inherent humanity. Let me know in the comments if you can think of a term that resonates for you instead of self-worth, that maybe makes this easier to attain or conceptualize. And to right off the bat negate this feeling of evaluating the utility we bring others, I like to look at this through the lens of a baby or a dog or a cat. A being that you love unconditionally. And we apply unconditional love so much more freely with these beings because we don't expect them to earn our love. If your dog chews up the couch, pees on the floor, you're going to love it anyway. It is not a bad dog. And when a baby is crying because it's a little bit gassy, you love that baby anyway. And we can learn to apply this same love to ourselves, even when we're doing something that ourselves or others might find inconvenient. It doesn't make us unworthy in any way. And I think this is a helpful frame for us to think about that through. But speaking of helpful frames, there are many branches of psychology or philosophy that have this view of humans having inherent worth. For example, the one that first comes to mind is humanistic psychology, specifically the work of Carl Rogers. This branch emphasizes human goodness, their potential, free will, but it also has the belief that humans need unconditional positive regard for a best self to flourish in a way that is not defensive, which makes total sense because when we're coming from a place of defense and trying to be good enough and prove that we're good enough, of course it's hard to branch out and flourish and try new things and let our free will authentically flow because we're coming from a place of deficit rather than enoughness. Here's a question I did not plan in the outline, but I want to throw out here. Something to kind of sit with or journal on. What if you decided you're enough? You are good and you are enough. As my therapist says, not that we're trying to be good enough, because that is a mirage we'll always be chasing. There's no benchmark. But what if you were good and what if you were enough? What if you were worthy? What if you were deserving? Whatever feels like it kicks up a little bit in you, but also opens a sense of possibility of, oh, what if I was? Maybe journal or think on that for a moment. What would change in your life? What would you do differently? What would you think on a day-to-day basis? What have you been afraid to do that you might explore? What would feel like it's opening up in terms of possibility? Just something to sit with. But other fields that take this into account, one is existentialism within philosophy, which holds the idea that humans have dignity even prior to their achievements. Many religions hold the idea that humans have worth prior to and separate from what they do. I know that it does vary from religion to religion, but many do believe that. And some parts of moral philosophy believe that humans have inherent worth, even apart from having to prove or earn that. But on the idea of moral philosophy, someone might say, well, doesn't this feel like cheating though? Or if I felt like I was a good person and I didn't have to earn my worth, what if I then started doing bad things or becoming extremely lazy because I didn't feel this need to, quote, be good enough? And they might say, yeah, if I let myself just feel good enough, I might lay around all day and I have to keep myself on a tight leash to force myself to behave a certain way. And I want to acknowledge one grain of truth to that and then move on to all my rebuttals. The grain of truth is that someone could hold themselves in very high regard and be performing pretty poorly. Granted, that does go against a lot of what we've talked about in this series of seeing reality clearly. I would argue that they're not, so they're not living very consciously. There could be a lot of reasons for that. Like we've talked about often repeatedly in this series, that generally people with a healthy sense of self-esteem have an accurate view of themselves and their strengths and limitations. So Usually when that happens, I think that it's again that overinflating and refusal to look at reality clearly. For instance, someone that maybe feels insecure about what they're doing at work, so they sit around and complain about how some other person there got lucky instead of having the courage to look inward and ask, what could I be doing to show up more effectively at work? Or if we take an example from 2 episodes ago, how can I take 5% more responsibility here? So I don't think that that is really something to be super afraid of.
So going back to that fear of if we feel worthy, will we become immoral or will we become lazy?
And broadly, I would argue that people that feel worthy, know their worth, and want to share their gifts and live up to their own internal standards. People living true to themselves, people that have healed their trauma, people that love themselves are often energized. However, they know when to rest, when they need a certain amount of rest, but then afterwards, they'll want to do something and be productive, but as a natural outflow of a desire for purpose and connection. The people that procrastinate indefinitely or feel stuck are more likely to be struggling with shame than to be struggling from too much self-worth. Similar to how we talked about in the beginning of the series, how often people inflict harm from a place of a lack of self-love, not from an excess of it. You know, the whole idea of hurt people, and it doesn't excuse the pain they're inflicting. But people will unfortunately inflict pain until they are willing to look at and acknowledge and heal their own, something I think we can all continually work on. This reminds me of something that's on a bit of a smaller scale, but that you probably encounter pretty often on a day-to-day basis. I will often notice when I'm talking to someone, if they need certain reactions from me. This could be validation. Wow, that's so great that you did that. You know, that kind of thing. And if I've ever said that to you, that doesn't mean I'm thinking that. I just mean there are certain people that need a reaction. They'll keep emphasizing something until you give it to them. Even if, let's say they're telling a story and they need you to think it's the wildest thing you've ever heard. They'll almost just keep upping the ante or trying to get you to see it a certain way until they get the reaction that they need. And it doesn't feel great to talk to these people. And I know I've been guilty of it too. Probably we all have at certain points. But I think that there's some people that do this more often and some people that do this less often. In my head, I used to call these big ego people and little ego people, which I know that that's not the proper use of the word ego, which is a really complex word we can pull apart another time. But it was just a loose phrase I had in my head to kind of keep these different buckets in mind, because I think knowing if I was interacting with someone that needed a specific response from me, it did take more energy. And that's how I became aware of this. But one day after I was getting coffee, I did like a 2-hour coffee with someone that needed quite a bit of validation. And again, validation isn't always a good job, but I think they needed a very specific type of mirroring and reaction in a lot of ways. And I was meeting up with someone after that who happened to be a therapist. And I just told them a bit about the interaction. And I said, what do you think is going on there? Is there an exact term for this? And they just said, wow, it really sounds like that person struggled with being seen when they were growing up. Oh, that was so compassionate. It melted me. And it was a really healthy reminder that often all of this is caused from traumas, big and small. We will, in a couple episodes, go into trauma. We should be probably having a guest on that one and talk about how that impacts self-concept so we can work on this through that route. But also, speaking of relationships and needing certain mirrors and validations from others, next week we are going to do an episode completely on that, primarily romantic relationships, but who knows, we might get into some other avenues as well. But let's finish this episode on self-worth with some action steps you can apply. I will link a research article down below that talks about getting self-worth from values, strengths, and relationships. We talked quite a bit about getting self-esteem from our values, and to some extent, character strengths make sense. It is a healthier approach than things such as comparison. I hadn't even thought about getting some of our sense of worth from relationships being healthy, but if we actually view it as just feeling good about ourselves because we have these quality connections with other people. We're emotionally connected. We're proud of how we show up for them. We feel good about the fact that we're connected in the world. I think that that's very different. So I'll link that study down below because I just found that an interesting caveat. Another step is focusing on what you can control. This is one reason why envy, jealousy, comparison, all of that can be so difficult, is because often we're taking the power and we're putting it on the outside versus asking, what can I control based on how I show up, based on my internal thought processes. Being in competition constantly does not feel good, and it does not bolster a sense of healthy self-esteem. We will have a whole episode on that later in the series though, so we'll keep moving. Another aspect is changing our habits and patterns that are in the small sense, but that add up a lot. So for instance, we've talked about this in the self-esteem episode, but I want to drop some different examples here. We can ask ourselves, what would someone who valued and loved themselves do? Would they compare themselves this often? Would they show up late all the time? Or would they not be able to say thank you for a compliment? Would they refuse to rest even when work can wait and they're exhausted? Would they say yes when they mean no? And doing the opposite can be very uncomfortable. A therapist has told me a good quote on this is that it is like brushing your teeth with your left hand. It will feel uncomfortable at first. Often people will try something like this on, almost trying on an outfit and be like, oh, that doesn't work for me. No, it's meant to be uncomfortable at first, and then it gets more comfortable in time. And then like we keep talking about in this series, it is then that upward spiral that starts. You feel better about yourself, so you take more loving actions towards yourself. We're going to talk about that constantly, but we're applying it here too. Next, self-talk. This is not saying that you'll never have a thought that is not loving towards yourself, but can we question it? Can we add to it? Can we pull it apart? Can we then find a little hole in the logic there? Can we talk to someone about it? Can we distract ourselves when we're feeling really bad about ourselves? Not permanently. We also want to go deeper, but what can we do to disrupt these thought patterns? And can we realize that multiple things can be true? That you wasted a whole afternoon when you really needed to be productive, and that you are still a lovable and worthy person that is good and enough. And like we talk about often on this podcast, not needing to be perfect, and that actually sets up lots of beautiful opportunity for growth. This can give us an opportunity to work on our grit, our growth mindset, and it would be really boring if we were perfect all the time. I think that it is really fun to explore the different ways to expand and grow. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. I can link 2 episodes down below on that will go deeper. One on grit, that also goes into growth mindset, and then one on perfectionism. 2 more action steps, and we'll get into a few footnotes. We can also apply self-determination theory, which goes into the idea of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, by Dr. Richard Ryan and by Dr. Edward Deci. They talk about the idea of internal and external motivation, and about how we feel very motivated when we have autonomy, when we have relatedness to others, and when we have competence in an area. We could do a whole episode on internal versus external motivation because, of course, when we're internally motivated, a lot of that's coming from the inside, kind of connected to this idea of self-worth coming from the inside. I believe that there are very few forces in the world that are as strong and as renewable as pure, authentic internal motivation, which I think is connected to even more than what we just talked about there. But I think something that can increase your self-worth is tapping into what are you truly motivated by versus what have you been doing simply to get a reflection from the outside or a certain reaction from the outside or to be deemed acceptable from the outside.
And connecting to the idea in the beginning about society valuing people for certain things, I like to often ask, what is a compliment that you usually get? What are you usually appreciated for? And then what do you wish you were appreciated for? This can help lead you to, what do you actually love about yourself the most? And that can help us get to know ourselves better, help us value ourselves for our true selves versus just what's been mirrored back to us by society. And another tip is to find healthier mirrors for ourselves in relationship. We talked earlier about how those, quote, people that seem like they have big egos or people that seem like they need a lot of validation and reflection, not having been seen often when they were younger. So, if that's you, which I think it actually applies to a lot of us, how can we find healthier mirrors in relationship? People that see us for our true selves, our emotions, our real internal world, instead of what they need us to be. Let me give you an example. Let's say that a man really feels insecure about his place in the world. A woman might end up in a relationship with him and pick up on the fact, subtly, even if it's not stated, that he really values physical appearance and having a beautiful woman next to him because that helps him feel better about himself. Subtly, she might realize, you know what, I need to look really put together when I'm around this person because that's how they want to see me. All of this will be unconscious, by the way. And if she sought out a healthier mirror, someone that really sees her for what she values most in herself, which might be something completely different, like her humor or her intellect, she might be in a different relationship because this person might not be capable of fully seeing her how she wants to be seen or as her true self.
And lastly, just realize that while we're going very deep here, I think that there is always more. Even after we finish this series, we might do more on this topic. I remember I was chatting with one of my friends. I was maybe 25 at the time, and I was realizing that so many of my problems were related to self-worth and this idea of, again, trying to get that from the outside. And I said, it's like I was digging and digging for gold, and then I just hit it in therapy. I get it. I get the root of all my problems. And he said, there'll be more. Keep going. And it kind of reminded me, now I can see in this zoomed out way, because he was totally right, that it's like I was digging for gold, I hit it, but that doesn't mean I sorted out all of my problems. So there's a lot here that we can keep going with, both in this series and probably beyond, because like we talked about in the first episode, this doesn't just impact how we feel about ourselves, it impacts how we connect with others, it impacts larger systemic things in our society for that reason, because when we feel good about ourselves and connect in loving ways with others, that also shows up in our work. It also shows up in our larger systems, both financially and politically, etc. So that could be an interesting thing to dive into another time as well, more of a macro look at this. Okay, footnotes. One is, I don't think that we fix this and then we never feel something like toxic shame that we talked about in the last episode. And I don't think that we get to a point where, I'm done with thinking about my self-worth, because we are still in a human body subject to human emotions and ups and downs. I have this weird thing that kicks up shame for me sometimes that's almost funny. I will share an example here of, despite working on this quite a bit, it just getting kicked up in daily life. Often at crosswalks where you're supposed to know when to go and there's cars and you're a pedestrian, I will sometimes get shame kicked up to the point that I'm literally quietly crying to myself after, which is so sad because I am in my 30s and I should know how to operate at a crosswalk. But essentially what happens is, often cars have extremely tinted windows. You can't really see in. I'm from the South, where people are sometimes, depending on where you are, overly polite compared to New York. And so I'll be trying to let people go. They'll be trying to let me go. Then I overcompensated and I thought, well, I don't want to annoy them. I'll just go. And then if you do that, maybe you walk across the street and they sort of rev their engine, annoyed later that you walked. Maybe you wave. There's some sort of feedback that was annoying, or you don't wave and you should have waved. I don't know. Moving from the South to New York, I've been here 12 years and I still think I don't know how to do a crosswalk here. But I think what it roots from, see, we always can go deeper. We always want to ask why. Is I am trying my best to do the right thing and be, quote, good in that situation. And I am misunderstood and annoying them. And then I feel that I've been, quote, bad. I think that it's this combination of wanting to be understood, wanting to be good, and also maybe a slight power dynamic. Anyway, I say all of this to say that shame can get kicked up in the most random things, and it is different for everyone. But then it can be an opportunity to then go deeper of, well, why do I need to be understood? What were situations where I felt like I was trying my best and it still wasn't good enough for the person that I was interacting with?
Footnote 2 out of 3.
A point that a friend brought up to me that might be a little bit more relatable for many people on this idea of contingent self-worth is that often people put a lot of their sense of identity into maybe one or two areas of life. For instance, someone might feel very confident in their body and They get a lot of sense of pride from their workouts or how they carry themselves. And then if they have something such as a chronic disease later, that can really shake their sense of self. Or if someone gets a lot of this sense of pride from their workplace, but then they get laid off, or their relationship, but then they have a divorce. So something we're going to talk about, it's planned to be in the last part of the series, actually towards the end, is building a more solid foundation of diversifying our sense of self so that I think I heard this example that if we think of it like a chair or a table, if there's more supportive legs, it's less unstable if something happens to one of those legs of the chair. But we also want to question what we even mean by a sense of identity, which we'll be going into in a couple episodes. Who actually are we? And who do we pretend to be as this mask or facade that we've been talking about in this series? And finally, I apologize if some of the terms that I use, if you come across them used both casually in society, used a different way, or also even in the research. For instance, when I was looking up the research on self-esteem, it's often used more in the sense of what you do and competence, often, I think, within the psychology space, I believe. For instance, I'm going to read a quote here by Dr. Christina Hibbert. It says, "Self-esteem is what we think and feel and believe about ourselves. Self-worth is recognizing I am greater than all of those things. It is a deep knowing that I am of value, lovable, and necessary to this life, and of incomprehensible worth. It is possible to feel high self-esteem, in other words, to think I am good at something, and yet not feel convinced that I am lovable and worthy. Self-esteem doesn't last or work without self-worth." And I think all of that's true, but I bring this up to say that we've been using the definition of self-esteem from the 6 pillars of self-esteem by Nathaniel Branden. But again, he was not a researcher. He was a psychotherapist, writer, but then he kind of got more into self-help space. So I am using these terms the way I've learned them and the way they make sense to me, where self-esteem has some self-worth within it because that's how he defined it. And that's how I first got exposed to this. But then it also has the sense of efficacy. However, some people view self-esteem more as that efficacy competence component, and then self-worth purely as just like, who are you under that? I say all of this to say you might encounter other slightly different, nuanced ways of using a certain word here. I really highly encourage you to not get bogged down in these details or get frustrated by it. I know it can be frustrating when you want something to be a very clean definition, but within psychology, especially just the way different terms are used casually, it's more blurry, at least at this point. We're not doing scans of people's brains and all of their thoughts. A lot of studies are even subjective. It's a very complicated science compared to something that we can measure and touch by weighing it on a scale. So I guess all I have to say there is the core truths remain, despite potentially someone using a term in a slightly different way in a different setting. But I think and trust that if you're the kind of person that turns to Immersion as a podcast you enjoy, that you can see, tolerate, and lean into that nuance. As always, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you for being here. And if you found this helpful and if you want to discuss this topic with a friend so that you guys can work on it together, because it is a heavy topic and I think we can benefit from experiencing it in community, consider sharing it with them and discussing it with them this week. I will speak with you next week on limerence, crushes, validation in relationships, primarily romantic relationships. Looking forward to speaking to you then.